Hi everyone, and welcome to our second video for this week, in which we'll focus on the idea of political media performers. Now, this video is very much intertwined with the study that you've been asked to read by Holly and Prisby, so please do make sure that you do read that thoroughly. It will give you a richer sense of the sorts of things that we're talking about here today, and that will come up in your quiz. Oh, the screen's off. Okay, sorry about that. So, politician as media performer. This is a quote from your Hollian and Prisby reading. Yet with all these policy differences between the candidates, many political commentators saw the election as being decided just as much on the basis of the personal characteristics of the candidates. Now, the election that they were talking about is a little bit further back now, the 2012 election. However, I think you can say that this applies perhaps even more now in terms of perhaps less of a focus on the platforms that we looked at before and very much a focus on the personalities or the qualities of the individual politicians. So you can see this cartoon here that, as cartoons do, over interprets or makes hyperbolic the different characteristics of politicians, and it is this over-the-topness that I think is celebrated and can be very helpful. So you see here the quote for Bill Shorten, that he has a tendency to blend into the wallpaper. So this discussion of Bill Shorten being boring is a sort of a key insult directed at him, and a key way of describing him as being boring. Essentially, him being boring or not boring has no real role in how good he would be at running a country. But you can see here that it's the sort of personality element that people fix on. So perhaps the politician who was our most successful media performer is Bob Hawke. Here, for those of you who are probably too young to know much about him, he was very famous for his ability to scull beer. So obviously, again, not something that has anything to do with his ability to run a country, but something that really endeared him to a section of the Australian public who felt that this made him accessible, this made him like them in some way. So you can see this picture here, and of course there are other famous people in there, but that is a good example. Tony Abbott created his own, or his people created the ultimate photo op by doing something that would no doubt attract the media to take photos of, both because it was just a very strange moment to have a politician in such a state of undress, but also because this is exactly the sort of thing that would attract media attention. It's sort of not taking yourself too seriously, and also, you know, being in the budgie smugglers and so forth. So this is a case of both getting media attention, but also by wearing his surf lifesaver hat and sort of a surf lifesaver-esque outfit. He's very much positioning himself with Australia. So we talked about national identity and what we see as Australian and so forth in week 3. Very much positioning himself with Australia and with a certain kind of Australian masculinity. Perhaps not a rugby player masculinity, but a surf lifesaver masculinity. So, you know, protective and brave and all of these sorts of things. So the visual image of the politician is a really important thing, as well as what they say. So I have here two images that are similar, framed in particular kinds of ways. The Turnbull fist. If you look at photos of him, you will see he almost always had, well, not almost, but a lot has this going on. But you will notice that he is photographed from below. He is photographed with the Australian flag behind his head. And he thereby, and with that together with the strength of the symbol of the fist, conveys power and decisiveness through this campaign image that's put out. Bill Shorten here similarly is shot from below, is looking very passionate, has his fist clenched, but perhaps a less powerful image because he is outside, he doesn't have the flag, and his face is posed in a different kind of way. So these are, of course, only small moments, small images, but in a context where we don't actually know that much about the people who lead us, each little image, each little quote adds up, as we've talked about with discourse, adds up together to what we know about these candidates. So here's Turnbull again. So I'm going to ask you to go back to the channel, the YouTube playlist, and watch this clip. It's a composite of different ads from the last Australian election. So we have a number of Liberal Party ads with different candidates, and I will ask you to note similarities and differences between these, and thus think about how they're branding the party. But there's also ads from the other side as well, and I would like you to note down some ideas about what's going on in terms of those representations, and what ideas are being set up about the politicians and also their policies. These two things may or may not go together in some of the videos. So make some notes there for us to talk about in the workshop. All right. So this next one I'll ask you to look at, shifting from the Australian context to the American context. I don't know how closely any of you have follow American politics, but they have a slightly different system where, in order to, unlike here where the party that wins decides who becomes Prime Minister, they vote separately for their president. This is probably old hat to some of you, but just to clarify. And in order to be your party's nominee, you have to run against all the other people that want to be the Republican nominee or the Democratic nominee. So a very interesting comparison in the Democratic race was the two front runners, or the two candidates, Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, who ran quite different campaigns. But what I think is interesting in comparing the two is they were running against each other, but unlike the later competition between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, there were, of course, similarities between Clinton and Sanders. And you see this nowhere more than in their campaign advertising. So it is quite interesting to see what messages they're trying to convey about themselves in their campaign and what they would do given the chance to be president. So I'm going to ask you to watch from the playlist this quite long advertisement from very early on in that race about Bernie Sanders, and tell me what you think it's about. Is it about? Does it emphasize emotion? How does it try and make you connect to the candidate or the candidate's message? What's going on? How much do you see the candidate? What kinds of people are represented as the sort of the default you and me characters in this advertisement? So I ask you to look at this, and then to put these in the wrong order, and then to look at the Hillary Clinton's first advertisement and announcement as well, and compare what the two of them are doing and what kind of techniques they're using. So I'm going to assume you've gone away and watched it and come back. This again is a candidate who didn't make it through, Ted Cruz, but I think this is a very discursively interesting ad that I'd like you to watch and have a think about, because it was taking up the question of what do they call it, strengthening the borders between the US and Mexico, but doing it in a way where they had 16 candidates who all felt that this needed to be strengthened, but in different kinds of ways. So having to be more specific, thus potentially I think a little bit more confusing in terms of what is being represented here. But using the enormous amounts of money that went into this election means greater cinematic values and a great looking product. So very different than some of the local candidate ads that you just recently analysed. So it's not just directly advertisements, things that say to you, this is an ad paid for by XYZ. It's also the theatrics and staging of all sorts of events that go into constructing the political figure and the media performer. So you'll notice in the background of this debate a plane, which is meant to represent what's part of a plane. It's not a real plane, but it was of that size, to represent the president's plane, Air Force One. So it can go from that sort of slightly silly prop through to using particular gestures. The act of holding babies, kissing babies, is of course a staple of the look, the image that politicians want to convey. Holding the baby says, I'm caring. It says, I'm taking care of our nation's future. And all these sorts of things that are intended to be endearing. They can be more aggressive gestures that are not looking like they're not overtly aggressive. So, for example, on the bottom left-hand corner, Barack Obama and Mitt Romney pointing at each other, using, I guess, small significations to demonstrate power, demonstrate likability, and all these sorts of things. And I will challenge you next time you're watching the news and seeing some political thing going on to pay attention to the body language, how things are framed in press conferences, for example, and that sort of thing. So Donald Trump very famously put, and Hillary Clinton, I think it did it as well, like a ridiculous number of flags behind them in press conference, like 20 flags, to show just how patriotic they were. So these sort of significations are taken extremely seriously. Having, you know, a little flag on badge on your lapel versus not having a flag badge. Having a politician, you know, eat something in a somewhat dorky way also can play a role. So these sorts of visuals or optics do play a very important case. Now, probably the most standout political media performer of a long time is Justin Trudeau, Canada's Prime Minister. I don't know how familiar you guys are with him, but he's got the whole sort of performer package happening. So, you know, he's handsome, you know, lovely wife, lovely kids. His father was also Prime Minister, and he projects this image, and I'm going to take off this so you can see it. On the top right hand corner, this is a key sort of image that Trudeau cultivates, or his people cultivate, of him as a family man, as someone endearing, someone who cares about you, cares about your kids, and is going to take care of you. So you can definitely see in there that there are certain types of representations that are sought. In this image as well, the picture is shot from a little bit below him, but fairly close to an eye line, and having the big Liberal in the top does certainly give you more of a sense that he's more accessible, perhaps, than something like that image we saw of Malcolm Turnbull, where he's looking quite commanding. Of course, the Canadian media love it all. As I was saying, he's pretty perfect for this role, and there are a lot of things like the From the Heart front page, and Trudeau Mania on the other page. This sort of image of him and his wife looking up with sort of nice lighting on them, and these sorts of things. Let us open our hearts. So you can see that people who really have very little idea of what Trudeau actually stands for and what he does might know about him or have heard of him for being that sort of political star in a way. So this sort of spin does not always work. It can backfire. So a very famous case that is, some examples of this are also talked about in your Holly and Prisby reading. But this famous case was a picture of Margaret Thatcher, who was Prime Minister of Britain at the time, in a tank. It was during the Falklands War, and this was sort of one of those images that just struck the public imagination. It was, of course, a photo op, as these things are, but yet there was something about her sort of taking her place in a tank to command and to lead the army that very much appealed to the population and appealed to her image. She was known as the Iron Lady. So even though she has the little white scarf and everything, it appealed that you know, power and so forth. Not doing terribly well in presidential race in the 1970s, the candidate Dukakis was seeking, I guess, a similar boost, and had been criticised that he wasn't, you know, he was a bit short, and you know, he wasn't really manly enough, and this sort of thing, that he would also have a photograph in a tank, and clearly this must have been to some extent inspired by, it wasn't in the 1970s. I'm getting my dates mixed up. Okay, scrap the dates. Inspired by this image, they set up this photo opportunity, and it's considered to be the image that sank his entire candidature, because people looked at it and said he didn't look like a soldier, he didn't look like a commander-in-chief. So that was that for him and his campaign. There were other things going wrong, obviously, but that was a sort of a key moment that didn't work for him. Now, of course, what happens is, in order to have these sort of sophisticated apparatuses that convey your message, your ideas to the media, you have to have a lot of money to pay for that. So the more spin, the more money is needed. So and to get more money, you need more spin. So essentially, the amount of money in political campaigns is growing all the time. It's particularly astronomical in the US in the last cycle, but still quite large in other countries as well. So the question then arises, and this is something that has been asked many times, is investment of particular kinds of companies, like mining companies, for example, playing a role in who give the money to help get a particular party elected? Is that then influencing that party to help them out in the form of policies and contracts and this sort of thing? So that, I guess, is a concern of having this heightened media element. So one more video. This is your video-rich lecture. This is a clip from The Daily Show with Trevor Noah, which is a very popular, or previously it was Daily Show with Jon Stewart, very popular comedy news. Some might call it fake news, comedy news, political comedy, something like that you would call it. And this clip discusses the idea of Donald Trump as actually being a creation of the media, just even though he dislikes the media so much, that they unwittingly or wittingly gave him an enormous amount of free coverage because he was so outrageous as a media performer that everyone wanted him for the drama. And I will ask you to go and watch that, have a think about it, and we will have a talk about it in the workshops on Thursday. So thank you.